In the heart of Pram Pram, Kofi and Amma were the targets of every whispered jest. Their hut was a patchwork of rusted iron and sun-bleached wood, standing in stark contrast to the painted villas of the cocoa brokers. They owned nothing but 3 chipped enamel plates and a single sturdy fishing net. Yet, every evening the village air carried the rhythmic sound of their joy. Their laughter was a rich, melodic symphony that seemed to mock the local creditors. "You cannot eat giggles," the bread seller would sneer, watching Kofi dance with his children under the baobab tree. Kofi didn't mind the mockery. He possessed a wealth the village couldn't quantify, a wife whose smile felt like the first light of dawn, and children whose eyes sparked with untainted wonder. They lived on grilled tilapia and communal stories, satisfied with the rhythm of the tides. Amma would weave mats while Kofi mended nets, their fingers often brushing in a silent language of devotion. They were the poorest in coin, but the wealthiest in spirit, a fact that irritated the neighbors who measured worth by the thickness of their kente cloth. However, the harmony began to fray when the harmattan winds brought a strange metallic chill. The sea, usually a provider of silent sustenance, began to moan. It wasn't the sound of waves hitting the shore. It was a rhythmic, haunting thrum that only Kofi could hear. It whispered of hidden depths and silver promises, slowly drowning out the sound of his family's laughter. The calling became an obsession that clawed at Kofi's sanity. While Amma slept, Kofi would stand on the shoreline, his feet sinking into the damp sand. The Atlantic didn't just roar, it spoke his name in a voice that sounded like clinking gold coins. "Kofi," it surged, "why settle for crumbs when the banquet is beneath?" He began to withdraw from the evening dances. His eyes, once bright with domestic contentment, became clouded with a salty, restless fever. He stopped mending the nets, letting the holes gape like hungry mouths. Ahmad noticed the shift. The laughter that once anchored their home grew sparse. "The sea is just water, Kofi," she pleaded, clutching his calloused hands. "It gives us fish, not dreams. Stay with us." But Kofi was already gone, his spirit drifting toward the horizon. He felt a divine right to prove the village wrong, to silence the sneers of the wealthy merchants who looked down on his ragged children. He convinced himself that he was doing this for them, the classic lie of a man about to lose his soul. One moonless night, the pull became irresistible. A shimmering path of bioluminescence carved a trail through the surf, leading toward the jagged rocks of the Devil's Ear. Without a word to his sleeping family, Kofi pushed his small, leaky pirogue into the black water. He paddled with a strength born of desperation, guided by a low, vibrating hum that vibrated in his very marrow. The village faded into a silhouette of judgment. As Kofi reached the vortex near the rocks, the water didn't capsize him, it parted. Below the surface lay a cavern lined with coral that glowed like neon. Inside, he found no fish, but the wreckage of a Portuguese galleon from centuries past. It wasn't filled with rotting wood, but with bars of solid gold and chests of raw, uncut diamonds that spilled onto the sand like frozen tears. The wealth was staggering, enough to buy the entire Accra coastline and every soul dwelling upon it. He filled his boat until the wood groaned under the weight. Each gold bar felt like a heavy seal on his previous life. As he touched the treasure, a coldness seeped into his skin, a numbness that muted the memory of his children's voices. He returned to the shore at dawn, not as a fisherman, but as a titan. He hid the treasure in a sea cave, bringing only a handful of gems back to the hut. He expected to feel triumph, but his heart felt strangely hollow. When he showed the stones to Amma, she didn't cheer. She recoiled as if he were holding venomous vipers. "Where did this come from, Kofi? This is blood-cold stone," she whispered, her voice trembling. He laughed, but the sound was different now. It was sharp, metallic, and lacked the warmth of their old poverty. "We are the masters now, Amma," he declared, throwing a diamond onto their dirt floor. "No one will ever laugh at us again." She looked at the diamond, then at him, seeing a stranger. Wealth arrived in Pram Pram like a tidal wave. Kofi didn't just build a house, he built a fortress of marble and glass that blocked the sea breeze from the rest of the village. He dressed his children in stiff, imported silks that made them itch and cry. The laughter vanished, replaced by the hushed tones of servants and the constant clicking of locks. Kofi bought the silence of his former mockers, but in doing so, he became the very thing he once moved beneath. The village no longer laughed, they feared him. He grew a belly of excess and a heart of flint. He spent his days counting ledgers and his nights back at the sea cave, driven by a paranoid need to protect his hoard. Amma became a ghost in her own mansion. She missed the smell of wood smoke and the feel of the sand. Now she was surrounded by imported perfumes that choked her lungs. The children forgot how to play, tethered by tutors and the burden of their father's expectations. The scandal began when Kofi decided the village wasn't enough. He wanted to own the land itself. He started foreclosing on the small plots of the men he once fished with. He used his wealth to manipulate the local elders, turning communal property into his private estate. He was achieving his goal of unmatched power, but the cost was the total erosion of his humanity. He had traded the sun for a yellow metal that offered no warmth, and the village watched in silent, simmering resentment. As the gold multiplied, so did Kofi's appetites. He found that the simple devotion of Amma was no longer enough for a man of his stature. He began an affair with Serwa, the daughter of a rival merchant he had ruined. Serwa was a woman of sharp edges and expensive tastes, a creature of the city who cared nothing for the sea. She fueled Kofi's ego, whispering that Amma was a peasant who held him back from his true potential among the elite. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of the heart, it was a betrayal of the family's foundation. Kofi began to spend weeks in Accra, leaving Amma alone in the marble mausoleum. The village buzzed with the scandal. The man who was once defined by his love for his wife was now seen parading a younger woman through the markets, draping her in the very jewels he had promised would secure his family's future. The happy poor family was now the miserable rich tragedy. One afternoon, Serwa demanded the location of the sea cave. She wasn't content with the allowance Kofi gave her. She wanted the source. Kofi, blinded by lust and the arrogance of his new status, agreed to take her. He felt invincible, believing the sea was his personal servant. He didn't see the dark clouds gathering over the horizon, nor did he notice that the water had stopped calling his name and had begun to growl a warning he chose to ignore. Amma discovered the betrayal not through gossip, but through a receipt for a beachfront villa Kofi had purchased for Serwa. The realization shattered the last of her patience. She didn't scream or throw vases. She simply walked to the center of their grand hall and began to strip off her gold jewelry. Each piece hit the floor with a thud that echoed like a funeral bell. When Kofi returned, smelling of expensive brandy and Serwa's perfume, she stood there in her old, tattered wrapper. "I am leaving, Kofi," she said, her voice steady. "Take your stones and your glass. I am taking the children back to the hut of my father. We were rich when we had nothing. We are paupers now that we have everything." Kofi laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You will starve. You have grown soft on my gold," he countered, clutching a heavy ledger. He didn't realize that his children were already standing behind their mother, their faces cold and distant. He watched them walk out of the gates, convinced they would return by nightfall when their stomachs grumbled. He turned back to his ledgers, but the numbers seemed to squirm like maggots on the page. The house felt unnervingly silent. For the first time, the lack of laughter wasn't a choice. It was an absence that felt like a physical weight. He called for his servants, but they had fled, sensing the shift in the wind and fearing the brewing storm. That night, a storm of biblical proportions hit the coast. The waves didn't just crash, they lunged like predators. Kofi, panicked at the tide would expose or swallow his sea cave, drove his imported car toward the rocks. He found Serwa already there, her eyes wild with greed, trying to haul a chest of gold into a waiting truck she had hired. The betrayal was complete. His mistress was robbing the very hoard he had destroyed his family to protect. "It's mine," Serwa screamed over the thunder. "You're just a lucky fisherman, Kofi. This belongs to whoever can take it." As they struggled over a heavy casket of bullion, the sea roared with a final, decisive fury. A massive surge of black water erupted from the cave, pulling the truck, the gold, and Serwa into the churning abyss. Kofi barely managed to scramble up the cliffside, watching his unmatched wealth vanish into the depths from which it came. The ocean didn't just take the gold, it took the cave itself, collapsing the limestone in a thunderous roar. When the sun rose, the beach was clean. There was no trace of the Portuguese galleon, no glitter in the sand, and no Serwa. Kofi stood alone on the wet rocks, his fine clothes shredded, his hands bleeding. He had achieved his goal of silencing the village's laughter, but he had also silenced his own. He was the richest man in the cemetery of his dreams. Kofi returned to the village, expecting pity or at least a remnant of his former status. Instead, he found a wall of indifference. The villagers he had stepped on, the friends he had foreclosed upon, and the elders he had bribed simply looked through him. He was no longer the lucky one or even the laughingstock. He was a ghost. His mansion had been struck by lightning during the storm and was now a charred skeleton of ambition. He went to Amma's father's hut, falling to his knees in the dirt. "I have nothing left," he sobbed, reaching for Amma's feet. She looked down at him, but her eyes held no recognition. The children hid behind her, frightened by the broken man who looked like their father but smelled of ruin. "You had a family, Kofi," she said softly. "You traded us for the sea's whispers. The sea has taken its payment. We have nothing to give you." The scandal was the talk of the region for months. The man who found a kingdom and lost his soul became a cautionary tale told to children. Kofi tried to fish again, but the sea remained silent. No fish entered his nets. It was as if the water itself had rejected him. He spent his days wandering the shoreline, muttering to the waves, begging for one more coin, one more chance, or one more laugh. But the Atlantic only offered salt and silence. Weeks passed, and a strange rumor began to circulate through the market. A new family had moved into a small, modest house on the edge of the village. They were surprisingly comfortable, though they worked no jobs. Amma and the children were seen wearing subtle, exquisite pearls that no local diver could find. The village assumed they were remnants of Kofi's wealth, but the truth was far more scandalous. Amma had been the one the sea was truly calling all along. The twist was revealed when a local boy saw Amma walking into the surf at midnight. She didn't go to the rocks. She walked straight into the calm water. The sea didn't roar for her. It smoothed out like a carpet. It turned out that the wealth Kofi found was merely the bait. The sea had used Kofi's greed to clear away the noise of his ego so it could reach Amma. She had made a deal with the spirits of the water to ensure her children's survival. She hadn't just left Kofi because of his affair. She had orchestrated his downfall by whispering doubts into Serwa's ear through a local fetish priest. She knew the greed of the mistress would trigger the sea's reclamation. Amma was now the silent custodian of the coast's secrets. She possessed a wealth that didn't require marble or servants, a wealth that stayed hidden in the shadows, allowing her to maintain the appearance of the humble mother while holding the village's economy in her palm. The story concludes with Kofi sitting on the beach, a tattered man staring at the horizon. He achieved his goal. He became a legend, a man of unmatched wealth who indeed changed his destiny. But as the title of his life story suggested, that wealth destroyed everything he stood for. He was now the beggar at the gates of the life he once owned. He watched Amma from a distance, seeing her glow with a quiet authority. She funded the school and the clinic, but always through anonymous donations. She kept her children close, teaching them that gold is a tool, not a master. The village no longer laughed at them. They bowed, though they didn't know why. The scandal of Kofi's fall was replaced by the mystery of Amma's rise. She had achieved what Kofi couldn't: power without the poison of pride. In the final hour of the final day, Kofi heard the sea call one last time. It wasn't a whisper of gold this time, but a mocking ripple of laughter, the same laughter he had once shared with his family. He realized then that the sea hadn't given him wealth. It had lent him a mirror to show him his own emptiness. He walked into the waves, not to find treasure, but to find an end. Amma watched from the shore, a single pearl clutched in her hand, as the water turned still.